Hi everyone, this is lecture number 5 for Latin America, Modern Issues, and it corresponds roughly to 486 through 520 of your textbook. All right, well, life is constantly changing in Latin America today. Although democracy is flourishing in most Latin American nations, there are still many challenges ahead for these nations, especially as related to poverty and urbanization. Latin America today is part of what we call the developing world. Many nations in Latin America are third world nations. The terms developing countries and third world countries are often used to describe these nations. They both mean the same thing. Latin America is still modernizing or industrializing. The term third world is actually from the Cold War era and was the term used to describe developing nations. Since the end of the Cold War, referring to developing nations as third world is less politically correct, but still widely used. During the Cold War, first world nations were the modernized nations that aligned themselves with the United States against the Soviets. Second world countries included the Soviet Union and those who were allied with the USSR. Third world nations were those nations who were still industrializing, who had perhaps not aligned themselves with either nation, or who were influenced by the US or USSR in other ways. Many third world nations were surrogate or proxy nations during the Cold War, where proxy wars were fought. Remember Vietnam and Korea from our last units? Remember? And finally, and this is really an important term for your Regents exam and final, some countries weren't part of this whole terminology during the Cold War. Some nations refused to take sides during the Cold War and kept to themselves. These nations were non-aligned nations and practiced a policy of non-alignment. And these included Yugoslavia and India during the Cold War period. Remember? So the term non-alignment means that you refuse to take sides in a conflict. Okay, well, back to Latin America. So Latin American nations are developing nations or third world nations today. Life is constantly changing for people. Life in much of Latin America today is characterized by a process of rapid urbanization. What does this mean? Well, people are moving to cities at an incredible rate. As healthcare improves in many of these places, people are living longer, and that's a great thing. However, with more people living due to healthcare improvements, there's a tremendous strain placed on nations in how to feed the growing population, as well as how to house so many people in urban areas. Additionally, although many people move to cities to find work, there often isn't enough work to go around. Simply put, there aren't enough jobs. Mexico City, for instance, has a population over 20 million people, one of the largest cities in the world. Sao Paulo, Brazil, has 18 million plus people and counting. Rapid industrialization presents Latin America with two main challenges. One, a need for work or jobs, and two, the need for housing. See, let's get back to number one, the need for work and jobs. Many new city arrivals find themselves desperate to secure work to support themselves and their families. Often, there isn't any work. Many people are forced to beg for survival. Those who find work often work in factories for lower wages and often under bad conditions, I should say. There's a growing middle class of people who include taxi drivers, street vendors, and salespeople. However, many people are just unable to find work in cities. This sometimes leads to crime in big cities in Latin America. Secondly, in terms of housing, well, simply put, there isn't enough affordable housing to go around. There's a housing crisis in most Latin American cities. Slums have popped up in all major cities in Latin America in which people build themselves homes out of whatever materials they can salvage or find. Some of these slum areas are called different names, including Villas Misterias, or cities of misery. They're also sometimes called pueblos jóvenes, or young towns, in Peru, as well as favelas, or shanty towns, in Brazil. Many of these places lack running water, electricity, or sewage systems, which can lead to horrible sanitary issues and the spread of diseases. Although there are challenges associated with urban life in much of Latin America, many people face similar challenges, if not worse, in rural areas. These challenges include an extremely harsh way of life. Many rural people are subsistence farmers who work small plots of land. They often live in small shacks without access to running water or electricity. People in rural areas often do not have access to schools, and many people are illiterate. Many of these small farming plots are located sometimes on larger estates of wealthy landowners. The farmers work the land as tenant farmers or sharecroppers. They are often required to give a portion of their crop to their landowner or are expected to give what little profit they can make to the landowners. This creates a vicious cycle of poverty for many farmers and their families, from which few are able to escape. Additionally, many tenant farmers owe sums of money, called debts, to their landowners and are never able to pay back these loans. Life is so harsh for so many farmers that many young people flee to cities to try their luck at getting jobs. Industrialization or modernization has not always had a positive effect on poor farmers in Latin America. Much of the land throughout Latin America today is owned by large multinational corporations. Although these large corporations run farms and they increase trade and crop output, they also put poor farmers out of business. Simply put, poor farmers can't compete with the low prices these companies can offer. This has further contributed to the huge divide between the rich and poor in Latin America. Other changes we see today in Latin America include changes in family life. Patriarch-dominated extended family structures still dominate society, both in rural and urban settings. Family ties and support systems are strong. However, in the event that the head of the family passes away or needs to leave to work in the city, the family is often left behind to fend for themselves. This places more pressure on those family members who are left behind. Godparents continue to provide a stabilizing effect on Latin American Catholic families. Padrinos and madrinos still provide advice and support to their family members. Despite changing family patterns in Latin America, there still exists a tradition of male domination in society. This male domination is called machismo or machismo. It has sometimes resulted in higher education rates for boys versus girls, although many nations in Latin America continue to address this issue by implementing social programs to help educate women. The Catholic Church continues to play an increasingly important role in people's lives in Latin America. We've already learned about how and why so many people practice Roman Catholicism there. We know that the European age of old imperialism resulted in the conversion of Latin American people to Christianity. More than 75 to 90% of people in Latin America identify themselves as Roman Catholic today. Following independence movements in Latin America, the Catholic Church continued to have a stabilizing effect on the region. The Church has championed land reform and fought on behalf of the poor for more representation in government and society. In many cities, the Catholic Church and other Christian groups have set up schools and health clinics to provide for basic needs. A popular philosophy that will emerge in parts of Latin America is liberation theology. Theology is a religious philosophy or way of thinking. Liberation theology was a doctrine under which nuns and priests vowed to take a more active role against poverty by changing the conditions that led to poverty. As a result of this way of thinking, many nuns and priests moved to impoverished areas in the 1960s and 70s and attempted to alleviate the pressures of poverty through assistance, education, health care, and social activism. Many of these priests and lower-level clergy members helped to influence social reform movements, often putting themselves at odds with official church doctrines. Gustavo Gutierrez was a priest who helped to establish the liberation theology movement in Peru. Another well-known supporter of this movement was Oscar Romero from El Salvador. Liberation theology became a political movement in the 1970s that called for massive social and political reforms to benefit the poor, or most vulnerable people in society. Supporters of this theory often fought against dictatorships and other unjust forms of rule in Latin America. Many priests, like Romero, were killed for their beliefs. In terms of economics, many nations in Latin America have taken measures to reform society and address inequality. Some nations have turned towards various types of socialism. Other nations have established mixed economies and have looked for foreign investment as a means to economic development. Mexico is a great example of this. In an attempt to lower tariffs, which are taxes placed on imported goods, and increase free trade, which simply means trade that has little or few tariffs, Mexico joined with the U.S. and Canada in 1993 to create NAFTA, or the North American Free Trade Agreement. Under NAFTA, a common market was set up between the three nations. Tariffs were pretty much eliminated between these countries, allowing goods to freely pass between the nations. This helped Mexico's trade with the U.S. and Canada, and it tripled it. NAFTA helped to create a trading zone that could more readily compete with the European Union, which is an economic and political organization in Europe that includes 28 member nations today, 18 of whom have adopted the euro as their official currency. Trade organizations are particularly awesome for smaller countries who otherwise would struggle in the world marketplace. NAFTA has contributed to Mexico's economy getting stronger. However, it has resulted in many American companies moving their factories to Mexico. This is great for Mexico due to the job growth, but results in more unemployment here in the U.S. The benefit to the U.S., however, has been stronger trade ties and bigger profits for some of our companies. So overall, NAFTA has been a mixed blessing for the USA. NAFTA has resulted in an increase in maquiladoras, or foreign-owned factories, in Mexico. Finally, many nations in Latin America have faced economic challenges like inflation, which means a nation's money or currency loses its value. A great example of a place where this happened was in Argentina. Argentina has had quite the history of political and economic turmoil. In Argentina, an army colonel named Juan Perón took over the nation in 1946 and ruled as a dictator. Perón established a socialist state. Perón and his wife, Eva Perón, became symbols for a new type of socialist totalitarian regime, many of which we've seen established in some countries in Latin America. Although Eva Perón helped gain rights for women, like the right to vote in Argentina in 1947, she and her husband also used brutal practices and terror to gain support. They often imprisoned politicians who spoke out against the regime, and they ended many civil liberties. They were criticized for living lavish lifestyles while in power as well. Perón eventually nearly bankrupted Argentina by trying to fund numerous social programs. Perón was forced out of power in 1955 in a coup, or military takeover. From 1955 to 1983, the military ruled Argentina, which means that they were under martial law. Massive civil unrest plagued the government during this time, and terrorist rebel groups emerged. Juan Perón came back to power briefly in 1973 with his new wife, Isabel Perón. Perón fought against these rebel groups, cracking down on dissidents or those who spoke out against the government. Eventually, the government cracked down on these terrorists or rebels and launched what became known as the Dirty War in Argentina. Under this brutal campaign, suspected terrorists simply disappeared. Workers, students, and anyone else deemed as an enemy of the state, they were kidnapped by the government, often tortured for information, and then murdered. As many as 30,000 people were killed due to the Dirty War. This violence resulted in widespread demand by the public for a new government, and this is a great example of how governments can be responsible for human rights abuses. Argentina is certainly not the only Latin American nation where human rights issues have occurred. Argentina's military-led government also engaged in a war against Great Britain over the Falkland Islands, 300 miles off the coast of Argentina, which the British had claimed and controlled since the 1830s. The Argentinians lost this war to the British, which further lessened public support for the government. Finally, in 1989, voters chose a new president, the first time a new leader was chosen without the military taking control of the country. Argentina is a great example of a nation that has seen political and economic turmoil. And apart from the major recession of 2001 and 2010, Argentina continues to build up its economy and stabilize itself politically. The first female elected president of Argentina is Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, who was first elected in 2007 and began her second term in 2011. Argentina is a case study or textbook example of some of the problems facing nations in Latin America. In Argentina, they have faced inflation over the years. Inflation means that the currency is not worth as much from one year to another, and can also mean that there is an increase in how much things cost. In 1985, Argentina's inflation grew by almost 1,000%. That basically meant that things that cost $10 one year would cost $100 the next year. Inflation prevents people from buying the products that they need. Other problems faced in Argentina and other parts of Latin America include high unemployment, government budget cuts, as well as foreign debt. The fastest growing nation in Latin America today is Brazil. With over 162 million people, they have the fifth largest nation in the world. Brazil has one of the most diverse populations in Latin America, including the largest population of Japanese people living outside of Japan, believe it or not. And I'm going to continue talking about this at the end or in our next lecture. So thanks for listening. We'll continue with Brazil shortly.